Good morning and welcome to our Strategic Coordination Workshop for 2022. This workshop forms part of our Heritage Month celebrations. We've had a weekly seminar series and had very informative and in sessions from the various operational units of SAHRA. For today's session, we will be looking at the coordination of the management of heritage resources. But before we get into that, here is a welcome message from the CEO of the South African Heritage Resources Agency, Advocate Lungisa Malkas.
Good day, my name is Lungisa Malkas. I'm the CEO of the South African Heritage Agency. Thank you all for joining us today as we celebrate the unique and diverse heritage of the country we call home. We are honored and humbled to have you as our guests. We are further honored to take this opportunity to share and celebrate the many areas of our cultural heritage resources with our community as we celebrate Heritage Month 2022. We are extremely diverse society with many layers in our heritage landscape, and we acknowledge that the greatest part about our heritage is this diversity. We are a nation of 11 official languages that also celebrates other languages commonly used by our international friends and visitors. We are also a nation that celebrates the indigenous languages of the First Nations that originated in our beautiful land. We come from a painful past which will forever be tainted by the legacy of apartheid and colonialism, which is why our heritage is so extremely important to us. Our heritage is a source of identity and cohesion for our nation. It makes us who we are. It shapes and molds us and gives us a sense of belonging. It is a story for all our children to share irrespective of their differences. It is passed down from generation to generation, linking the present to the past. Our heritage finds expression in our rituals, food, music, art, and our significant sites and objects. This is what makes South Africa a magnificent space. We are home to the most beautiful sites, objects, dating back prehistorical times, which opens a window into lives of the earliest ancestors of our humankind. Our indigenous knowledge systems, which have been preserved by our elders and traditional healers, are also a vital part of our heritage. This year's Heritage Month webinar series is taking place in the shadow of COVID-19, which has taken massive toll on human life, on our communities, and on our economy. As the world recovers from the battle against COVID-19, we are encouraged by the united global effort to beat the virus. It shows that through collaboration and cooperation, we can achieve and overcome anything on this planet, which is why we are taking this year's Heritage Month webinar as an opportunity for us to collaborate and build a global network of partners that will assist us in developing a world-class heritage sector in South Africa. I thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful message, CEO. My name is Ben Wasinga. I am the manager of the Built Environment Unit at the South African Heritage Resources Agency. I am presenting and facilitating this session on behalf of the Executive Officer for Heritage Resources Management, Ms. Mama Kamoreng Nkasi Lisowona. I am joined in studio by SAHRA's Head of Legal and Company Secretary, Mr. Simpiwe Mome, who is right here next to me. And today's session is going to focus, as stated earlier, on the coordination of the management of these heritage resources that form part of our national estate. Now, the National Heritage Resources Act aims to promote good management of the national estate, and importantly, it aims to enable and encourage communities to nurture and conserve their legacy so that it may be bequeathed to future generations. And this is the opening statement that is found in the National Heritage Resources Act. I think it's quite important that we reflect upon that little bit there that states we are enabling communities to manage their own resources. So SAHRA does not promote a top-down approach to cultural conservation. We believe in a ground-up approach and grassroots enablement of management of these resources. So today's session, we will be looking at exactly that. Mr. Mome will be providing a presentation on the legal context to coordinating the management of heritage resources. And on behalf of Ms. Nkasi Lisowona, I will be presenting the Heritage Resources Management Coordination Plan of 2022, which is still in its draft phase. Following that, we will allow for questions and inputs from our guests present with us today. And following that, we will have a short break, after which we will have our Varsity Vibe Roadshow initiative, which will be presented by Mr. Devon Brainers and Dino Talotti. So just to reiterate, this session will run from 11:30 to 1:30 p.m. Following that, there will be a 30-minute break, and then our Varsity Vibe Roadshow will start at 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. So we hope you can stick around for the entire program today. We have a lot of exciting content which we wish to present to you. And without any further delay, let me hand over to my colleague, Mr. Simpiwe Mome, so he can present his item again, which is the legal context to coordinating the management of heritage resources. Over to you, Simpiwe.
Good morning, colleagues. Sorry, there seems to be some sort of an echo. All right. There seems to be a bit of an echo. Apologies for that. Good morning to everyone. Glad to have everyone here and just to be given the opportunity to be able to present this presentation that I've been asked to prepare. From the point of view of, sorry colleagues, I'm just trying to maneuver this. Thank you, Ben, if you can assist. How do you do it? Thank you so much. So this will basically cover the following points. I'll be doing a bit of introduction, and then basically talking about the subject matter, the legal context to coordinating management of heritage resources, and then I'll towards the end just highlighting some of the issues and just reflecting. To everyone, I know that we all aware. I mean, I think in the previous sessions, there's been a reflection on the mandate of SAHRA, where we draw that from. So I will not be repeating anything. I sought to maybe just bring up the opening statement, and I'm glad that Ben has sort of like spoken to that. But I think we're very much aware of the first page as you open your National Heritage Resources Act. It talks about the establishment of SAHRA, and it talks about why SAHRA is being established. Yes, it still talks about the establishment of SAHRA and Council, which is basically the board overseeing that, the functioning of SAHRA, and it also talks about why SAHRA is established, and that is to coordinate and promote management of heritage resources at the national level. And it talks about setting norms and maintaining essential national standards for management of heritage resources throughout the Republic. I won't be going through the whole opening statement, but I think it's just important to note that we do have the full legal mandate, and the specific functions that will appear in different sections of the Act. But it's interesting to note that the particular statement that is on your opening page is also appearing at section 13. I'll cover that later on. And it's also important to note that as well, we have the tier system, SAHRA is obviously at the top of that. We have provincial heritage resources authorities, and we also have local authorities that are also tasked with this heritage management. Now, our duty at that level, we have to ensure that the provincial heritage resources agencies are properly assessed and they have the powers, because they're not supposed to do anything in terms of Section 8. And it also, I'm going to be bringing up some critical departments that are responsible for maintaining or just implementing certain pieces of legislation. There we're talking about the Department of Mineral Resources. I'm mentioning just a few. Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, the Department of Police, also known as SAPS, and the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure, amongst others. We do have the international instruments and organizations like in UNESCO, and colleagues know that we also have Interpol in certain cases where we may refer some crimes to them. You'd find that SAHRA is featuring everywhere. We're playing a role everywhere, because the issue of coordination may be happening at the national level. We may be responsible to ensuring that at the provincial level there's the functioning, and the provinces also ensure that the local authorities are competent. And I think through one of the presentations, it was highlighted, I think it was yesterday, that at the moment we only have one local authority, and that is a bit concerning, and which is the City of Cape Town. Now, just going further, that we also tasked with implementing some of the national policies For instance, the policy on repatriation and restitution restitution and repatriation of human remains and objects relating to that. And also we have some partnerships that we are fostering through some legal agreements with some stakeholders. And this is also linked to the first part, and that is ensuring that entities, department, and everyone perform and do what they're supposed to be doing. Just to be specific or zoning in terms of this mandate, if you look at Section 13 of our legislation, it says that we are tasked with establishing national principles, as I've already highlighted. However, it just goes further to say Section 13, subsection 1B says to coordinate the management of the national estate, and that is by all agencies of the state. We're very much aware of what those are, and it says other bodies, and there are so many. So you can imagine that this task is quite big, and one, if we go towards the end and on reflection, we'll be talking about the challenges that we have regarding that, and making sure that that is possible. One could possibly say that maybe we haven't reached the optimal level. However, we are, and I think, forging ahead, and I think the progress has to be recognized. So, colleagues, I've already spoken about the trade tier system and how what we're responsible for in terms of the provincial heritage resources authorities. I then just note that we do have provincial legislation. For instance, if you go to KZN, and at the moment I think they're busy preparing their regulations in terms of that legislation, and one has to be aware of the provisions of Section 57 of the Act, which basically provides that in matters that relate to their competency, if there's a conflict, their legislation prevails. So, which is a bit, for some people, they might find challenging to understand. We know that municipalities have the powers to, have bylaws, and we do have that in terms of Section 54 of the Act. So I think I brought those up just for colleagues to reflect, because this heritage management is quite huge. And it may even be bigger at what some people may view as the lower level, provincial and local. In terms of, we're talking departments now, I think a great deal has been said in some of these presentations. Was one sitting, listening with interest in relation to the BGG, or the Burial Grounds and Graves presentations yesterday. And you'd find that some of our challenges have come from that area. And if you go up north in terms of mining, the DMR, I'm going to call it that, the Department of DMRE, sorry to be correct, is responsible for implementing the Petroleum Resources Development Act and many other pieces of legislation and regulations, and you find that issuing of permits, SAHRA becomes a commenting authority in most instances, and you'd find that presents us with challenges. We've, for instance, sat at the public protector, where some of the roles are not quite clear in terms of the department. What is the role of the department? What is the role of SAHRA? And people complaining and just trying to link, and you'd find that some of the challenges, as you would see towards the end on reflection, are not just about whether or not we ensuring that there's proper coordination of the implementation of the legislation, but however, some of the challenges are social. And you find that it would be nice to have DMRE addressing the issue of the social beneficiation in certain instances. And going on the DFFE, I think the biggest challenge that we have is out of the energy crisis that we have in South Africa, and we know what they're responsible for. And you find that SAHRA is a commenting agency in that event as well, authority to be correct. And the challenges that we have, I tried to choose a nice or appropriate picture, and I couldn't find anything that has ESCOM in it. And I would imagine that colleagues, when you mention that name, be pulling their hair one by one. There is an urgent need for our colleagues at one of the units internally are responsible for implementing some of these regulations in terms of Section 38. And there's a need to address. I don't want to speak about what has not been properly established, but at this very moment, there's a huge engagement to go ahead and ensure that there's a shortage of energy. We contribute towards addressing it. So, however, that being done needs to not lose the sight or the importance of heritage management. So, we have to make sure that we are ahead of that as well. The Department of Police, colleagues, don't be frightened by the picture there. The firearms, I know it's not an ideal picture to have, but however, we do have firearms as heritage objects. We play a role there as well. If you're looking at the legislation that is implemented by that department. And before they are destroyed, we have to assess, and we appoint experts. We've had some challenges. Some experts have gone to court, but doing the wrong things. But I'm not going to go deep to on that. But we have to be ahead of that and ensuring that all those firearms that have heritage significance are not destroyed. We have a relationship with the department because we have to play our role of coordinating heritage management. Now, if that heritage goes away, we would not have done what we're supposed to do. With the UNESCO, I thought to bring some of these items. Some of the pictures are local. You see the picture of Mapungube there. However, I thought to bring the Timbuktu manuscripts would be appropriate, just for colleagues to be aware of the fact that heritage management is just, we internationally, heritage is important, and we link the efforts, and we have to make sure that it is properly coordinated. We link the efforts with the international organizations. And you would note that we are South Africa is a party to many of these conventions. I have them there. And we've already had, or we have enacted, or we have gazetted the World Heritage Convention Act, number 49 of 1999, which shows our commitment in that regard. Colleagues, I'm not going to go into detail because I don't want to take up too much time in that regard. We do have the DBW, sorry, I mixed it up a little bit. Playing a role in terms of managing call it the government assets, properties, and you find that some of these are heritage resources. We have to make sure that they do what they're supposed to be doing. And you look at, they have, they call it the GIAMA, the Government Immovable Assets Management Act. However, you have to read it with the understanding of what is set out in our legislation, and there's something very specific there, Section 9, and I remember when we first crafted the regulations in terms of Section 9 with some of the colleagues at the DBW, because in terms of that section, we had to do it in consultation with them, and I'm bringing that up. Had to be done, and it is done, and it is part of doing what we're supposed to be doing in terms of Section 13. If you read there, and which is linked to the coordination and establishing principles, standards, and etc., which is what we did. So you'd see I tried to find, but that is the Victor Festo Mandela House in Dragonstein. You're seeing the late former president sitting there, colleagues. So we are also I'm sorry, colleagues, I'm going toward the end. We are also responsible to ensuring that we implement the national policies, as you would understand, as I've already mentioned, and we've done quite a bit in the past, and albeit not in terms of a policy of this policy. I must say that this was only recently approved by the cabinet, and SAHRA has been allocated. And in terms of that policy, SAHRA has to, or in fact is busy establishing an office which is called a Repatriation and Restitution Office. At the moment, I think we are busy with recruitment in that regard. If you were to go to our website, you'd see that we are busy with that. And in terms of that policy, SAHRA is tasked with coordinating the restitution and repatriation of human remains and heritage objects relating to that. Now, you see that this coordination is not just, in terms of what we have in South Africa, but also coordinating and ensuring that whatever happened in the past, and we lost some of the stock icons, whatever happened is addressed. And we repatriated in the past Moses Kotane and Mr. J.B. Marks from Russia. I think this was done in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, colleagues. And recently, Mr. Patrick Mbundla was repatriated. His remains were repatriated from Botswana. Now, you can already see the mandate and what it covers. Now, I mean, on reflection, one has to ask, is it going smooth, this coordination? This establishing, standards, norms, and whatnot, and ensuring that the bodies and entities are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Also, in certain instances, monitoring. And if you look closely in Section 15, that is one of the responsibilities that we have, linked with coordination. Yes, and maybe no in certain instances. If you're looking, for instance, at some of the challenges that we have at the provincial level, find that just on reflection, at the moment we have 2 provincial heritage resources agencies that have been assessed and been given full competency. Now, you'd find that there's a great risk for the other provincial heritage resources agencies, and they've been non-responsive in terms of, and I would like for them, some sort of reaction. But in terms of engaging SAHRA, responding to what we seek to do, often communicated, say, in terms of Section 8, subsection 6, we're supposed to reassess you every 2 years. Provide us with the following, complete this following form, because we're doing what we're supposed to be doing in terms of coordinating heritage management and ensuring that it is done properly. And we have challenges in that regard. How do we seek to address? We, at the moment, even have a target in terms of our I think in terms of our APP, and we've managed to, or we've listed this as one of the risks, because whatever they can't do, the PRAS has to be done by SAHRA. At what cost? Because we don't have the resources, so we have we're putting together a strategic coordination plan. We obviously looking into reviewing the legislation or maybe looking at the structure of the heritage management. Is a three-tier system working? Does it need to be changed? Those are some of the questions that one need to ask themselves. I've already spoken to the challenges in terms of mining and the issue of beneficiation and some of the challenges that we have in terms of grave locations. The issue of energy crisis. I think I would be just overdoing it if I had to say more there. And the challenge that we have at the moment to do things urgently to ensure that we do what we're supposed to be doing in terms of issuing permits for certain things, in terms of addressing the issue of energy. SAPS or the Department of Police, what are the challenges there, or is it going smooth? I know that in 2 years ago or a year ago, we entered into an MOU with the department in ensuring that the issue of the firearms is addressed properly. But we have other challenges in terms of enforcing the legislation. And when we have, contraventions, we have challenges with the colleagues there, not understanding perhaps the mandate of SAHRA and their mandate, because they have the duty to ensure that contraventions are addressed and people are fined accordingly. And the legislation there also needs to be reviewed in that regard. I sort of highlighted the issue of some heritage objects challenges that we have. And we have the issue of the NFTs, which is coming thick and fast in our faces. I think less said about that, the better, because in terms of our legislation, that is not properly addressed. We could look to review and addressing that. We have other challenges in terms of legislation, people not understanding the mandate of SAHRA and what we're supposed to be doing in that regard. But I won't be zoning into that. But colleagues, we have solutions and we have the plans that we have, but SAHRA can't be doing that on its own. Hence, the mandate to coordinate the heritage management, which needs more than just SAHRA. It needs the other departments, bodies, entities, and it also needs everyone, the colleagues in the heritage sector, and the professionals, everyone to be involved in our communities. So our role is basically to coordinate that and acknowledging that we have challenges, but we also are progressing quite well in terms of even if we may be said to be claiming it, but I believe that we are progressing quite well, albeit we may need some resources to do better. But thank you so much, Ben. Appreciated the time. That is the presentation, colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mome, for that wonderful presentation, looking at the complex issues that basically inhibit our ability to coordinate the management of heritage resources. And, you raised a number of very important, I'd say, contemporary issues, modern issues that our Act may not have anticipated. For example, one would never have anticipated that digital currency and non-fungible tokens would now be impacting heritage resources management. One would also not have anticipated that an energy crisis would also have a severe impact in terms of heritage resource management. So it brings into, I'd say, stark contrast our ability to respond to these challenges. For example, you raised the issue of PRAs. Now, PRAs, I would say the issue of PRAs and provincial authorities is a legacy issue. It is an issue we've been grappling with for over, I'd say, 15 years at this point now. And at this point in time, as you stated in your presentation, there is provision for us to enter into unique agreements within each region in order to coordinate the management of these resources. So the idea that we need every PRA to behave and act like Heritage Western Cape or Amafa, I think at this point is something we have to reconsider strongly, perhaps we can enter into management agreements with other authorities, other government departments that have the capacity to manage heritage resources. But again, you raised these as very important and pertinent issues. If you have any comments or questions, I do see some of them coming through in the chat. For Mr. Mome, please go ahead. We will have a discussion after my presentation on behalf of Ms. Nkasi, at which point you may directly engage with Mr. Mome. But a very big thank you for that presentation. I think you've contextualized and set the stage very well for what I will be presenting here today. So let me get into my presentation so we can look at the draft plan and the thinking of SAHRA about how to basically deal with the issues that Mr. Mome has raised in his presentation. So again, this presentation is on behalf of the Executive Officer for Heritage Conservation Management, Ms. Mama Kamoreng Nkasi Lusoona, and she has asked me to present today on her behalf the draft Heritage Coordination Plan. Just give me 1 second to share my screen and then get going with the slideshow. Now, following from Mr. Mome's presentation, in which he again provided the legal context, as well as I'd say he provided the most pertinent issues that are basically prohibiting or inhibiting our ability to coordinate heritage resource management. And given the reality of these issues, SAHRA still, as the national body, has to respond to these issues. And we have to look at it through, I would say, as Mr. Mome has presented here, our management framework in South Africa. Now, what does the law state, or what does the NARA state? The NARA provides for an integrated and interactive system for the management of national heritage resources to promote good governance at all levels and empower civil society to nurture and conserve their heritage resources. Now, this is a quote that I read at the beginning of this presentation today. And again, we must just emphasize that we are trying to promote good governance and empower communities to nurture and conserve their heritage resources so they may be bequeathed to future generations. But what are the limitations that we have to accept in terms of this three-tier system, which Mr. Mome said we may even have to reconsider? The first is that there is one national body that deals with conservation management of heritage resources, and that national body is SAHRA. And our objective or our function is to coordinate the identification and management of the national estate. And then we have 9 provincial heritage resources authorities. Again, as Mr. Mome has stated in his presentation, not all of them are functioning at the capacity that they should, but we can also accept that the Act makes provision for 9 of these authorities at provincial level. But most importantly, we have to look at the fact that there are 278 municipalities in South Africa, all right? And this tells us that the majority of the capacity in terms of governance is at local level. So when we talk about the management of the national estate, when we talk about the coordination of this management, when we talk about having a cohesive system, we have to take into account that the majority of that capacity exists at a provincial and at a local level. And if we do not empower the provincial authorities or empower the municipalities to fulfill this function, then we have already failed before we have begun. So I think we need to just place emphasis on that fact that SAHRA is one body at a national level, and it's meant to coordinate these 278 municipalities and their 9 provincial authorities, as well as their partners, conservation bodies, and communities. So as we look at these numbers, or as we look at this particular slide, we must just bear in mind that when we talk about a 3-tier system, It was not meant to be a system where you have one national authority and some functional pros with one municipality having capacity. That means that the majority of the stakeholders who are involved in heritage resources management do not have the legislative authority or the relevant delegations to fulfill that function. And that is something that our coordination plan explicitly is trying to address. Now, when we talk about the national estate, this particular slide looks at what I would consider to be all of the features or all of the resources types that you may find within the South African national estate. And I think it's worth going through them very briefly, because it begins with equipment or tools of cultural significance, and this may be archaeological materials or heritage objects. We then talk about significant buildings and structures, of course, which we know they are numerous, and most of them being at provincial level, structures that are over 60 years of age. We have provincial heritage sites and we have national heritage sites. But beyond that, an often ignored aspect of the built environment is the grade 3 sites that should be managed at a local level. We also have places and landscapes of significance. So these are sites such as Table Mountain and Dal Yusufat, as well as Bush and Dal Farm Estate, which are landscapes of significance. We have archaeological and paleontological sites. We have sites of significance that relate to the history of slavery. We have geological sites of scientific and cultural importance. We have objects associated with living heritage. We have living heritage itself, which was discussed quite extensively this morning by SAHRA's Heritage Protection Unit. And then, of course, we have heritage objects as well as the significant collections. And then we have significant graves and burial grounds. So again, this list is not exhaustive. We may be omitting one or two features or resources that could be included here. But this is what we are talking about when we say we are coordinating the management of resources. We are coordinating the management of these specific resources within our national estate at provincial, national, and local level. And again, with one national authority and thousands of these resources, we cannot at any point reach an optimal level of management without including our partners and relevant authorities in terms of this coordinated effort. So this brings us to the question of our stakeholders in heritage resource management. And again, it's worth mentioning them one by one, simply because with one national body currently playing this coordinated role, it is important that we look at what or who it is that we're trying to coordinate with. Who are these entities that we need to enter into agreements with and unique management arrangements in order to have an optimally managed national estate? But beyond that, so that we can plug the gaps that Simpiwe Mome had mentioned earlier in terms of the lack of capacity at provincial and local level. So number one is all heritage resource authorities, and this will include SAHRA as well as the provincial authorities and local authorities. At this point in time, it has been stated by Mr. Mome next to me, as well as by, I think it was Clinton Jackson earlier this week, that only one local authority out of the 278 have been given competency to manage heritage resources. And then we have our national and provincial departments across the board who also fulfill this function. We have a number of state entities, the most prominent ones being the Department of Public Works. We have the Department of Forestries, Fisheries, and Environmental Affairs. We also have other departments, such as the Department of Correctional Services, which comes into play. They also manage heritage resources at their sites, such as Victor Verster. So there are a large number of state entities that are also involved in conservation management. We have cultural institutions and, of course, our partner institutions and our sister and brother organizations, such as the National Heritage Resources Council and the Zico Museums, to name a few. We have the local authorities, which I already mentioned. We have our research and academic institutions who have been thoroughly represented this week during the presentations. We had representation from CPUT, UCT, UWC, the University of Witwatersrand, to name a few. And these institutions are quite critical in terms of training, as well as producing the heritage professionals that will assist us in terms of managing our national estate. Quite importantly, we have conservation bodies. And why I say conservation bodies are extremely important is because they play a specialized role in terms of identifying and monitoring certain resources that are within our national estate. Without conservation bodies, you may find that we do not receive all of these reports of heritage crimes that take place. So conservation bodies are quite critical. And then at a smaller level, we have the community, which involves individual persons, families, as well as the communities in which they are found. We then also have traditional leaders. And today's discussion around heritage, intangible heritage, will speak directly to traditional leaders who are the custodians of all of these cultural practices that we find within our national estate. And this also links to educators, which we can speak to in terms of research and academic institutions. And then an often ignored entity is the private sector, which again has a lot of capacity and resources, and also has heritage resources within their own estates, which they can assist us in terms of managing. So again, this list is not exhaustive, but this is our target audience. And these are the role players and stakeholders that we believe need to be included in terms of heritage resources management. Now, with that said, we are currently developing our 5-year plan in order to best coordinate heritage resource management. Now, in this particular slide, I know that there are 5 points, and it appears that in every year we're only going to be targeting one of these points, which is not true. Number 1, 2, and 3 can all happen in 1 year simultaneously. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that we have our 5-year plan, but these are the 5 outcomes that this 5-year plan is focusing on. So the first one is basically related to the previous slide, which is the identification of the relevant stakeholders. If we do not know who we're going to be managing with, then there is absolutely no point in trying to roll out this plan in the first place. The most important aspect is, who are we going to achieve these outcomes with? Who are we going to achieve this optimal level of coordinated management with? So our first outcome is identifying thoroughly our list of stakeholders and role players. And again, the previous slide begins to allude to that. Secondly, it's about getting the basics right. And when we talk about getting the basic right, it means that we need to clarify the roles and responsibilities of these role players and at which level they'll be managing. Why do I say this? Because as Mr. Mome earlier stated, we have this 3-tier system that empowers the PRAs and it empowers local authorities, but we know that it has not been working well for over a decade. At this point in time, when we begin to rethink how to best manage the national estate, we may find that we enter into agreements with state institutions that have capacity, such as SANParks, the local authorities, or even SAHRA, and that these authorities or these institutions that have capacity can be given delegations to manage heritage resources on behalf of the provincial authorities. So it's quite important that we, again, clarifies the role and responsibilities of all of our stakeholders, and this can be achieved again through the relevant memorandums of understandings, or as we call them in our sector, heritage agreements. Number 3, the third outcome is planning and rolling out. Once we have identified our stakeholders, once we have entered into these relevant agreements, again, rethinking this 3-tier system or maybe adapting it to the current reality, we will then have to roll out and execute these agreed upon heritage agreements. And again, that may be through unique arrangements where in certain provinces where the PRA is not functional, we have different authorities or the municipalities fulfilling those functions. Then, of course, we have project implementation, which I think is self-explanatory. And most importantly, we have accountability through reporting and review. We need to monitor all of these outcomes continuously in order to ensure that they are best implemented for an optimal state of management in terms of our national estate. So that was just to brief our stakeholders and those who are present here today on SAHRA's thinking around the coordination of management of heritage resources. And we look forward to any questions and comments that may be coming through from you at this point in time. Thank you so much. That is the end of the presentation. And I see that there have been a number of comments throughout the chat, which I have not been engaging with while I was presenting, but I will begin to look at your comments and I'll invite some of you to make direct input on the floor. Myself and Mr. Mome are here to answer your questions as best as we can. And we also invite you to answer each other's questions as best as you can. So let me just go back to the program to see exactly where we are. And then we will engage with all our stakeholders from that point. Okay, so we are at the Q&A. And let me look at the comments that have come in. And Ms. Fratini Claudia, if you are still in the meeting, you mentioned that there is a challenge of coordination between departments and it's felt across the board. Ms. Fratini, would you like to elaborate further on that? You are welcome to switch on your microphone and provide your comments in person.
I am still with you. I'm hoping to. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, you're loud and clear.
Okay, super. I think that the coordination between departments is, or the lack of coordination between departments is felt across the board. In as much as I think what people look at is they look at legislations as working in silos, and there is a lack of integration with legislations. In other words, if I'm working in this department, then only the legislation that deals with this department is relevant to me. But I think there needs to be some sort of awareness within departments themselves on how legislation works across departments. And I don't know how this is going to be achieved, because one would presume that somebody that is in a department is aware of the various aspects that are relevant to them that work outside of that specific department. That is a challenge in itself. But I think the major problem is that legislations are viewed as single entities devoted only to that department.
Thank you so much. I'm going to give Mr. Mome a chance to respond to your comments. But before I do that, I just want to say you are absolutely spot on in terms of this siloed mentality. And I think that is the entire purpose of having this coordinated effort. We need to look at it in the sense that the heritage requirements of a province like Mpumalanga will not be the same as Gauteng. And of course, again, we have PRAs that have various levels of capacity in terms of their own functions. And therefore, how can we rope in other state entities or conservation bodies to manage these resources or to better coordinate in terms of their own mandates? Mr. Mome, please go ahead.
Ben, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ms. Puccini, for the question. I must say I agree with you. Really, there is that silo mentality. I think we recognized that as SAHRA a long time ago. And one of the things that we've done, for instance, you're talking about, I think in the presentation I mentioned the issue of firearms and management of or coordinating the heritage management of that. We had to enter into an agreement with the department to ensure that, there is a recognition that, actually we're supposed to be doing this. SAHRA is supposed to be doing this. Please recognize this. How do we work together to ensure that heritage is managed properly? And I think at some point, I think a few years back, and we've been pushing for this, and it's just a pity that it is not reaching the conclusion that it should. We were looking to work with SARS, for instance, in terms of customs and ensuring that heritage resources don't leave the country. Now they are implementing the legislation in terms of their mandate, and that is SARS. However, we, in order to ensure that heritage resources don't leave the country, we have some of the recent examples, but I won't mention them. But it is such a pain because they don't recognize that actually you were not the permit in terms of your legislation was not sufficient. You were actually supposed to look at compliance with the other pieces of legislation that are around, and one of them being the National Heritage Resources Agency. Did you do that? No. Now, how do we work together to ensure that that is addressed? We have a draft agreement in that regard, and we've I know that in the last few years we tried to engage SARS to ensure that we enter into that. We have had other engagements with other departments, and I think I made the example of sitting at the public protector regarding the grave relocation. It was such a pity to see that the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, it was DMR at the time, was just responding to questions relating to their mandate or in terms of the legislation that they're implementing. And obviously SAHRA had to respond in terms of the mandate. And fortunately for us, our mandate in relation to that aspect was linked to their legislation, because we were commenting authority in terms of their legislation. Now, how do we work together to recognize that that we need each other, and that the matters will not go to the public protector? Where you have people in our society complaining and taking matters to the public protector, we will address them. They won't even need to get there. So I think really there is a sort of like a unanimous or I would say great feeling in terms of agreeing to the fact that we're not really there. However, we have done so much to ensure that we implement our mandate in terms of coordinating that part and ensuring that we meet our obligations. I noted that one of the colleagues highlighted the issue of the constitution and the governmental cooperative governance. And if you read different pieces of legislation, that is somehow read into, or that is highlighted somewhere somehow, and you'd find that some sections assume that that is working, and unfortunately it is not. And I suppose there's a lot that we need to do in terms of addressing that. There was another question that I wanted to respond to, but Ben, thank you so much for that. And I think if it comes to mind once again, I will react to. If I may, recognize the question from one of our colleagues saying, given the plan and the model of the coordinated heritage management plan, how do we address and approach scenarios where there is a destruction of heritage resources that are in custody of state entities, departments? One has to recognize what we've done in terms of, I think I mentioned the regulations in terms of Section 9, because the state entities and departments have a responsibility. One could ask, what has SAHRA done so far? And what we did, even designing or putting together that those regulations, was to make sure that we would sit in this boardroom with the colleagues from the department and the different powers to ensure that we do what we're supposed to do in coordinating, putting together those standards, and the outcome of that, and it's been reviewed recently to properly address the issue of heritage objects, and the colleagues at the different departments and entities have the responsibility and the duty to ensure that destruction just doesn't happen, or that heritage resources are not lost. So, Ben, sorry, let me not take it too far. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Simpiwe. I think you are heading in the right direction. And I'm going to call some of the colleagues and individuals making comments in the chat just to maybe further elaborate on the points that they are making. Nancy, Regina, and Leomile, I will be calling on to you just to maybe further elaborate on your points. I think you've raised a lot of very good points in the chat. Let me maybe start with Ms. Regina Isaacs, who's also asked, is the three-tier system of managing heritage resources realistic? Very good question. Regina, would you like to elaborate further? Please come online.
That have established themselves, to effectively manage heritage resources. It was feeding one of the presentations that local government, heritage sectors or departments are not really fulfilling their role. And even what has unfolded in our country, given the challenges, the services, the load shedding, is it realistic for us to think that the way in which the legislation was drafted or what was envisaged 20 years ago is so relevant and realistic today? So I really think that this is a question that needs to be addressed, not just by SAHRA, but by the department and I think other stakeholders as well, because we've seen it as well. The legislation says that there are state entities that have very specific roles to play in heritage resources management. There are even functions of being heritage inspectors, for example. And they're not fulfilling that role. And some of the arguments is that they don't have the capacity, they don't have the resources to do this work, that is besides the fact that SAHRA has been provided training. So we're sitting with all these challenges. And of course, the legislation is the framework within which we must manage the heritage resources, but our reality is different. And in the 20 years that we've been trying to implement it, I cannot see that things are going to change, and therefore we really have to give some thought to reviewing the legislation and the way in which we manage heritage resources. And let us not forget about all the resources that are available. Spheres of government, provincial and local. The money is there, but the functions are beautiful. I think that we have to.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for those comments. I'm gonna maybe invite Nancy and then Leomile to the floor, and then we'll just give a response, myself and Simpiwe. But Nancy says that very similar to Regina, after 22 years, which is SAHRA's age, to see the lack of capacity on a provincial level and local level is disheartening. One cannot help but feel that heritage is simply not a priority. Nancy, would you mind coming online and just further elaborating on your point as well?
Thank you, Ben. I think it just stems from the fact that the old NUC, when they had a presence in each province, one did sort of we feel that there were more feet on the ground, so to speak. And having seen that change over the years, it hasn't quite panned out the way one would have liked to have seen it pan out. And as I said in one of my comments as well, if one looks at the challenges, especially local authorities are dealing with, health issues, clinics, schools, water, electricity, all these things. You just know that heritage is then not going to take a priority in their situations. And it's not fair on SAHRA as well. A lot of our staff are fulfilling the role of PROS at the same time, overworked. And our budget is certainly not sufficient to, to do all this work. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I think we're going to pause and respond here because you've raised such an important point around the fact that SAHRA used to have regional offices, and we have this three-tier system as a result of our constitution, not wanting to have a centralized management framework. But again, perhaps the previous system was working better, and that's something we should consider. Let me bring Simpiwe in here. I think he has a lot to say about this. Simpiwe?
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Ben. Talking about the structure that we had, the provincial offices, I think it was. Now, looking at the PRAs, in some provinces, the PRAs are just not established. And I think it's not a secret. And I sat in one of the meetings in one of the PRAs, I'm not going to mention the name, and getting a report that a budget allocated was around 1 or 2 million. That was heartbreaking. What is the office supposed to do? What are the colleagues supposed to do with that amount of money? And mind you, you have salaries to pay, you have offices to rent, you have to have access to your vehicle, because that's one of the the requirements when we assess a PRA. They have access to those things. They must have computers. Now, with all of that, do you still expect them to implement it? Surely not. Which is in pale in comparison to KZN or MAFA. And I remember when we sat, I think it was this year or last year, assessing MAFA, we were a bit embarrassed. We were a bit embarrassed to find that MAFA has a budget. I think it was over 50 million, Ben. I stand corrected, and they have cattle, livestock, valued at such quite a significant amount. And some PRAs have the resources, as Regina says, and some PRAs just don't have. And I suppose I must agree with Regina, with Nancy, that the issue of heritage management is just not a priority. So I think we've had a situation where our chairperson, former chairperson of the council, had to visit each and every one of the PRAs to try and understand, and not just meet with the PRAs or the councils of the PRAs, for those that are set, but also to meet with the MECs in the provincial departments to try and engage them, because we're trying our best to ensure that we do whatever is possible from our side to assist the PRAs. But however, we can't really do much. And I've had colleagues questioning even the structure of the 3-tier system, and surely not just the provincial offices, but also the fact that the PRAs report to the MECs, not to SAHRA. And some people get confused, and sometimes, when you get the complaints, they think that SAHRA becomes responsible for what PRAs are not doing or what they may be doing wrong. But if you read the legislation, and if you understand the powers that we have, we are really tied in terms of saying we can recommend certain things, but we can't force the PRAs to do things because they don't report to us. They report to the MECs in terms of the way things are set in terms of our legislation. So I just wanted to bring that up, Ben. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I think it's such an important point, and it's worth maybe discussing. I think it's a big discussion that could again have a session of its own, because we're talking about the restructuring of the current management arrangements that we have. And again, as Nancy stated earlier, perhaps having a specialized, centralized national body that is also fulfilling these functions at a regional level in partnership with provinces may be a better approach. So it's something that we must note, and I think again it's worthy of a much bigger discussion at a later stage. Simpiwe, you kind of answered Leo Mile's question around the model of a coordinated heritage management plan and how we address or approach scenarios where there is destruction by the state. Leo Mile, I'd like to bring you online just to maybe further elaborate on your point and add anything else if there is anything else. Please come online, Leo Mile.
Thank you, Ben. I think part of my question, I do take what Mr. Umwe had said, and I think for me it's just an understanding exactly like what you said. How do we enforce sections such as Section 9? Because we sit in a precarious position where we recognize these state departments and state entities as partners in this model and as drivers in assisting us to protect and conserve heritage objects. However, we also sit in another scenario where as SAHRA, we have floods of reports from the public expecting us to do something when there is destruction of heritage resources. And when you further look into what kinds of these heritage resources are being destructed, then you notice that it's in custody of the very same departments and entities that we work with and we sit around the table and discuss with. And so you sit in a position where you start asking yourself, how do we become proactive more than reactive? Because at the end of the day, we now need to go back and, it becomes a discussion once again, but then to have we haven't done much except send an email, a follow-up, a site visit. Not much has been addressed in the fact that there is loss of heritage resources and the partners that we have MOUs with and we sit and discuss, it's not translating into practice. And that's where my question comes from, is that how do we start having that very proactive or even if it is reactive, but one that is quite, shows the public that we actually are working towards addressing these matters as and when they come up. And that's where my question came from. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you are now basically hitting the core of what this coordination plan is trying to address. The heritage resource management as it is now is an extremely reactive, I'd say, function. Once the resource has been destructed or is under threat, then we act. And the question you're asking is, how do we then have a proactive approach outside of monitoring, outside of site inspections, especially outside of those instances where the resource has now already been affected? Then SAHRA is being brought into the picture. I think it's a very good question. I'll pass over to Simpiwe just to maybe further address you. Simpiwe? You kind of touched on it, but as she states now, how do we become more proactive? How do we enforce against the state who is supposed to be protecting these resources as well? And we have Section 9, which is noted.
Yeah, I suppose it goes back to the issue of I think was it Regina or I think it might have been Regina talking about the issue of working together, the governmental cooperative governance, because now if there's non-compliance, what do you do? You could talk proactive, you could engage, you could set standards, you could do all of that, and you could keep monitoring and doing all that. However, if there's non-compliance, what do you do? Now, in terms of what we have, the framework on governmental or corporate governance, you look to try and avoid the conflict. You try and address things, and I suppose that is what I'm trying to look for the right way. I don't want to say waste time, but effectively, you try and do all that you can to avoid implementing such or certain strict measures. We have Section 50 and 51. You don't want to be doing there, especially with your sister entities or the government. And we are government. You try and avoid that, but there are times where it may be necessary. I know we generally with the other stakeholders and in our communities or any other person, you try and educate. However, you would have to move with those sort of actions if there is a failure. However, there's a duty in terms of legislation and the constitution to engage even further with the departments and entities and try and avoid going legal, which is a bit of it might present us with a bit of a problem, and it might create some sort of expectation from these departments to say, well, he's not going to take us to court, or well, he's not going to call the police, or they're not going to call the police on us for allowing this to happen. So that presents us with that challenge. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Again, these are very, very complex questions, and we will try to answer as best as we can. But again, even what you've asked here, Leomile, is something that is worthy of a session of its own. And maybe just before we conclude, I see there's one more comment that has come from Mrs. Machete, and not really a question, it's more of a comment from her, but she's basically stating that there are 4 PRAs that are active now: Western Cape, Amafa. Eastern Cape has just formed committees that will approve applications. I am aware of that. Myself and Philip actually presented to them. And Free State PRA is also actively monitoring their heritage resources. Ms. Machete, if you are online, would you like to further elaborate on your point or ask any further questions of clarity? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Program Director. I think the Act is stating clearly that SAHRA will continue assessing PRAs, whether they are active or not, and give them the assistance that they need. Hence, you went to the PRA and gave assistance, and Eastern Cape have done the same thing. Remember, officials in this PRAs, they come and go. Whoever is left might not know or gave information of what they were using, tools that they were using to monitor their heritage. And the new ones that are coming, who's giving them that capacity or knowledge that they need. So it's us as SAHRA, because ever since that is why I left, I don't remember having any PRA that has been assessed. And they are relying on us because we are the national office. We need to give them guidance of the do's and don'ts and also assist them all the time. It's our mandate as SAHRA to do so. And those that we have trained really, they are trying to keep up with whatever that they wanted, they want to do. For example, we had a council meeting, the Northwest PRA chairperson was there in the meeting. He didn't know that there are committees that need to be formed. He didn't know what to do. He wanted assistance from us as SAHRA. The bus is with us and the ball is in our court to assist them and not saying we've tried all these years. Yes, we know we've tried all these years, but they still need assistance from SAHRA. And we don't have capacity, they also don't have capacity. But those who are willing and able to get information and work on it and try and come up with new ideas of dealing with their heritage in their own provinces, let us help them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you are speaking directly to the fact that, every context is unique, every province is unique, every region is unique. And while, again, we've followed a uniform approach, meaning that we believe every province should have a PRA, we also assume that every MEC will have the same level of interest in heritage as those that have functional PRAs, and it has proven to not be the case. So I also agree with you that irrespective of what we say here, the legislation and the act says that SAHRA must provide that assistance. So the buck at the end of the day does stop with us. And I think that's also why this coordination plan becomes extremely important, because in those instances where there is no capacity for the PRA, there is no capacity that SAHRA can give to assist the PRA, what are we going to do? What unique arrangement can we have there? Thank you so much for that. I'm not sure if you have any more input, Mr. Momi. All right. So colleagues, I think you may continue to engage in the chat, but this brings us to the end of our short session today. Today's session was basically to present the plan, or apologies, I see there's a hand from Ms. Frattini. Go ahead, ma'am.
I'm sorry to interject.
No problem.
Or make you run late.
No problem.
I was just wondering whether or not I could get an answer to my question where I asked, and it's in relation to the stakeholders, the slide that you showed on the stakeholders. And I'd like to know, where would foreign entities fall? And I'm asking this, I actually have a vested interest in this question. As you might know, and I will be engaging with your colleagues on this question of peace. But in the case where a site is maintained by a foreign government, the site still belongs to the South African state. In fact, it belongs to Public Works and run by correctional services, but is, and in inverted commas, scare quotes, maintained by a foreign government. And this foreign government decides to do extraordinary maintenance on the site, whereby changing the character of the building and not taking into account the historical integrity and sentiment behind that structure. So I think we do need to, and we have quite a few of these sites in South Africa where you've got foreign entities or foreign governments maintaining the site that essentially belongs to South Africa. And to add, maybe insults to injury, those sites have significance to South Africans of that foreign body. For instance, Italian South Africans, Polish South Africans, and so on. I think there needs to be something in this framework that looks at that as well, because at the moment we find ourselves a little bit in a no man's land. Who do we have recourse to when these kinds of things happen? And so far, I must say, SAHRA has been fabulous with us. They really have. You guys have been absolutely awesome. But I think we need, I'd like some engagement on that aspect. Thank you for indulging me.
Thank you so much. I think that is a fantastic question. And I think you pointed out a major blind spot in terms of the stakeholders that are presented in the slideshow. Thank you so much for that. Firstly, let me state that it is a fantastic question because not only do we find resources in South Africa that have an appeal or significance to maybe Italians or French people or Portuguese, Dutch or Spanish people, South Africa itself also has resources in other foreign countries that fall into a similar category as to the one that you're mentioning. Nancy mentioned in the chat that there's Delvaux in France, which is one example. And one site for me is actually OR Tambo House in Zambia, which is significant to South Africans, but is in Zambia, and we have to enter into unique agreements for that. Thank you so much. It's a fabulous question. I'll allow my colleague Simpiwe to answer, but I do see there's a hand from Ms. Machete, who I think wants to make input to this. So Ms. Machete, please go ahead while Simpiwe clears his head. I can see he's on the spot.
Thank you, Program Director. It's quite true that if the site is in South Africa, as long as it's a heritage site, they need to abide by our legislation, which is SAHRA. If there is going to be any maintenance or development on the site, and for example, built environment, if the buildings are over 60, they need to maintain them. They still have to apply for a building permit from built environment. They can get funding from the foreign countries, but still they need to apply and we need to enforce our legislation. If in the near future, or if you have got a current issue now concerning the site, you can as well send an email so that the relevant unit can go and do the site inspection and give you a site report to tell you what is happening on site and the do's and don'ts on the site. And will also as well give advice of how they must deal with maintenance of the site. I won't mention the ones that Nancy has mentioned and other colleagues. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that response. I think you've given Ms. Frattini the relevant guidance. And again, I just really appreciate the question, because when we talk about this coordination of resources, we must consider that there are foreign interests that also speak to our national estate. So it's a fantastic question. Simpiwe, any further input from you?
I would like to really not mess up what Ms. Machete has said, because she's really covered what was being asked for, because really that is the case. And it would only be a challenge if, for instance, let's say the building is what do you call this? There's some sort of a diplomatic unity, and you find that you can't really go in. It's like if it's an Angolan whatever
embassy,
embassy, or it's got some sort of immunity, so you'd find that you can't really enforce, or you can't really force them to do certain things, because it's generally in terms of our law, it's almost like a country within its country. That's why when we had that gentleman, was it Snowden or whoever that guy was, he ran to this house in, I think it was, I'm not sure which country it was.
Ecuador embassy.
Yes, so he was able to hide there, and nobody could touch him for the longest time, because it's the independence is respected in that respect. But however, you'd find that that is a very unique situation, and in general, all the buildings would be, as Mr. Machete says, would have to be, whatever you do, you'd have to comply with our laws. It's a bit different when you're talking about properties. For instance, the site in Delvaux in France, we own that, and we also we are this entity that manages heritage, and you'd find that in terms of our legislation, we can do certain things in a foreign country, and we, as long as there is an agreement that will give us the powers to do so between this country and these other countries. So it's a bit of a complicated and intricate situation. However, I think Ms. Machete has addressed Ms. Frattini's question.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Simpiwe. And again, thank you, Ms. Frattini, for that wonderful question. I think in terms of just your input, we will update that stakeholder list to look at shared heritage, is what we call it, to be diplomatic, but also you have interest in other countries that that may speak to your national estate as well. So it's a very good question. It's a big blind spot which you pointed out, and we cannot talk about a coordinated effort if we do not look at international partners as well as international agreements that we may have to enter into. Thank you so much for that. Colleagues, are there any further hands? Is there any more input before we conclude the session? I'll just take a moment to see if anyone else has anything to add. Ms. Machete, your hand is still up, but let's give Ms. Frattini an opportunity again. Ms. Frattini, please go ahead.
Sorry, I don't want to be monopolized.
No problem. Please, the floor is yours.
Just one question. In terms of ownership, what is meant by ownership of a foreign site? Does it mean that the deed, does it mean that the deed and the property belongs to the foreign entity?
Okay.
Or does it mean that the foreign entity has usage of the property in terms of certain stipulated, let's say, agreements in perpetuity? Again, I refer to my case in which the property, the buildings still belong to the South African government, but the foreign government has usage of the site in perpetuity
Okay.
as long as it is being maintained.
Okay.
So I think I just need clarification of what is meant by ownership.
Thank you so much. I think we're going to have a much longer discussion around this, but I'll try to answer your question as best as we can. Because what it comes down to is who we consider to be. Let's get out of ownership or foreign governments, etc. Let's look at the word custodian. All right. If we are talking about the custodian of the site, which means the person who has rights of access to the site, the person who is most likely maintaining the site, irrespective of the title deed, etc., someone can be a custodian of the site. And I think this is what Mr. Mome was referring to earlier, that you can have a building in South Africa that is within South Africa's borders, but because of an agreement with the Italian government or the Spanish government, it becomes Italian property. And you may even find that the Italians have jurisdiction over that property, irrespective of its ownership. So in your instance, I think the custodianship becomes important because there are many complex arrangements. You'll find that there's this land which is owned by correctional services, but then the land was bequeathed to the Italian government in 1948, and the Italian government now has custodianship of that land, but they are not the owners. So you do get those very complex arrangements, and I think we must engage further around this point of yours. But what I would say is, if they have an agreement which was signed in 1901 or even 1850 that gives the current occupier custodianship, they have rights that are similar, if not exactly the same, as an owner. Because if the agreement is in perpetuity, it means that you have transferred those rights to them in perpetuity. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but that's just my assessment, and I'd love to maybe hear more from you about this case. Would you like to give more input, or have I covered it? Go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have to now leave you.
Okay, thank you so much.
But I look forward to our engagement of peace.
Thank you so much. And you have my email address, so I'm looking forward to your communication. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, colleagues, with that very complicated question and my best attempt to answer it, we have reached the end of this session. Again, I'll just take a small second to see if there's any further input, any other hands that the colleagues would like to raise at this point before we conclude. All right. In the absence of any hands, I really want to give a big thank you to all of you for your participation, for your engagement. It's, of course, we are at the very beginning stage of implementing a coordination plan. But what has come out strongly here is that the status quo can no longer continue. We can no longer accept that we must have PRAs, and whether or not they're functioning then becomes immaterial. What we need is actual functional bodies, whether it is through unique arrangements with state entities, community bodies, conservation bodies, or as in the Eastern Cape, just setting up committees with delegated authority to fulfill these functions. It is a question that we will have to answer. It is what this plan is going to try to address. And again, this is only the beginning. There will be many follow-up engagements in which we discuss this coordination plan. With that said, I want to thank my co-host here today, my co-pilot, Mr. Mome, for a very stellar job and for his wonderful presentation. And again, thank you all for your engagement. It is much appreciated. With that, the session is now officially adjourned. Thank you so much, colleagues. Thank you. All right. Thank you. Oh, one more to go.
Okay, this is